Coming up on this week's episode of The Right Side, BC fish farms are under increased scrutiny from the BC government. Mainstreet is singled out as polls get another election wrong in Alberta. Singh refuses to denounce the Air India terrorists, and Bill Morneau gets caught in a conflict of interest. This is The Right Side, episode 39, recorded Saturday, October 21st, 2017. Polling Truths. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. Patrick and myself are here on this Saturday in October. Welcome back.
Welcome back. It's good to be back. Lots of things happening this week. Lots of things going on in the media, and lots of different stories out there that are very interesting and ones that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I don't think we have a head scratcher every week, but we definitely do have something that you don't see all that often, and it's a wonder why it hasn't happened sooner, but we'll get to that just a little bit later. But of course, what we're here to do is we're here to go through the news, go through the media, and remove the bias and sensationalism that inevitably gets inserted into the news reporting, and see if we can make some sense of what's going on. And to do that, we're actually going to start off right off the bat with BC this week. So what you got?
Well, what I've got is something that's been kind of talked about in the media over the past since the summer, but not very much, as there's been a lot of other topics for them to digest and go through. So it's something that's likely to rile up coastal British Columbians almost more than the existence of pipelines is probably the existence of fish farms. Now, fish farms are used as a way to provide the world with an ever-increasing demand for fish without causing disastrous overfishing or extinction, kind of like what happened with Atlantic cod. So it's estimated that almost 2/3 of the world's farm fish are supplied by China, and there are many American and Canadian hatcheries along the Pacific coast, and it's very common for Atlantic salmon to be farmed near the ocean where Pacific salmon are known to live. And it's a topic that causes concern for many First Nations and environmentalists, as mixing farmed Atlantic and wild Pacific salmon could cause unintended consequences for the Pacific salmon stock. But of course, stopping the fish farms completely could cause a rapid depletion of fish populations. So when the NDP came to power this past summer, Premier John Horgan promised to, quote, align the actions of his government with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or as it's called, UN DRIP. So as Perry Bellegarde, who is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, has put it, the UN Declaration gives Indigenous peoples, quote, the right to say yes and the right to say no. So that's one interpretation of the declaration, of course. So on Friday, the lead cabinet minister in charge of the fish farming file, who is Agricultural Minister Lana Popham, she sent out a letter to fish farm operator Marine Harvest Canada regarding its continued presence on the BC coast. Quote, I have recently become aware of Marine Harvest's decision to restock the Port Elizabeth salmon farm, wrote Popham. And this was referring to ongoing activities at one of the company's dozen or so operations off of northern Vancouver Island. She says, it comes at a very sensitive time. We are entering into sensitive discussions with some of the First Nations in the area who remain opposed to open net pen salmon farming in their territories. The minister then proceeded to put the company on notice regarding its obligations towards First Nations as the NDP sees it. She says, our government has committed to implementing the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, she wrote. Practically, this means that companies should make every effort to develop and maintain healthy relationships with First Nations in whose territories companies are doing business. Whatever operational decisions you should choose to make, the province retains all of its rights under the current tenure agreements, including potentially the requirement that you return possession of tenured sites at the end of the current terms. So that's basically saying toe the line and make sure that you do what we want you to do, otherwise you're not going to be there for much longer. So Marine Harvest, which was the company that Popham sent her letter to, through the course of 3 decades of her operations on the BC coast, has established working relationships with 15 different First Nations and 7 First Nations-owned businesses. However, there's several holdout First Nations, one of which has lately staged anti-fish farming protests at the constituency offices of Popham and Premier John Horgan here in Victoria. Popham was saying, in effect, that it was not enough to build working relationships with most First Nations in the vicinity of a given land use or resource development project, and that unanimity was among all affected First Nations was now required. It's kind of no small order in a province that has 203 recognized First Nations, especially when the traditional territories of each First Nations overlap. Now,
Doesn't
there's a
it
few different
seem
ways you
doesn't it seem as though that's perhaps a bit of a blank check that was given to them regarding this?
Yeah, it basically is. It makes it seem like the First Nations will now have a veto on certain things, which is something that interestingly Trudeau discussed about when he was talking about the Northern Gateway and the Enbridge pipeline, as well as the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, is that First Nations do not have a veto. Um, Anyway, there's a few different ways you can take the letter. The more magnanimous approach would be that the NDP government wants the fish farm operators to take into account First Nation wishes and to be as careful as possible to not cause any mixing of the stocks. And the other way to take the letter, of course, is that the government is actively willing to shut down any fish farm's operating license and tenure agreements in order to satisfy the First Nations veto that is implied by UN DRIP. So we'll have to see what comes of this. The media hasn't really been unbiased in its coverage. Many post-media outlets have penned pro-fish farming articles, while more liberal sites have slammed the fish farms. In reality, there's probably a more middle ground that journalists should be occupying, and that's that fish farms are necessary for fish consumption, but more careful oversight should take place to avoid environmental disaster.
Yeah, that hits the nail on the head entirely because, from the article and what we're talking about here, it almost sounds as though a blank check was given. But at the same time, I think everyone can agree that when you compare practices in our country compared to other countries in the world that have coastal waters, China and whatnot, I think you're going to find that the standards that Canada puts in place are going to be better than those that you find in China. Yet it always feels as though when it comes down to situations like that, fish farms and other industries of that type are unfairly vilified in Canada, when I'm sure the vast majority, in fact, probably well beyond the vast majority, upwards of 90%, I would say, maybe even more, are probably operating within the confines of the rules, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the Canadian fish farms certainly have a lot more rules upon them than do other countries, like we mentioned China before, but even the American ones. Now, this past August, there was an American fish farm that accidentally had a breach, and it accidentally let out a bunch of Atlantic salmon into waters in near along the border of Washington State and BC, and there were lots of concern there of mixing of the farmed Atlantic salmon, mixing with the wild Pacific salmon stocks, and how that would affect their spawning cycles.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the American fish farms don't have as much regulation on them as Canadians ones do. And we see that a lot of cases in the difference between Canadian industry and American industry, is that Canadian industry is generally a lot more regulated than the American ones are.
Yeah.
So what would happen in this case is if the Canadian fish farms are shut down, that means that there is a bigger demand for the American fish farm stock and the practice that they would have. And they would have no qualms in continuing their practices and in fact increasing their demand and their production in regards to the demand that the closing of the Canadian fish farms would do. So there is a necessary need for the Canadian fish farms to stay open. Now, is there a possibility that there's a bit of malpractice there? Yeah, there is. I mean, there should be a lot of oversight on this to make sure that there's no mixing happening. But for them to be, for the journalists and the media to be talking about this as if it's like there's no problems with fish farming, and then the other side talking about how it's basically the devil's practice, uh, it's not really doing the general public any favors, because when it comes to fish farming, it's a very complex issue, and there's really no right answer in how to deal with it. All we can do is have negotiation,
Yeah.
and that's something that a lot of the journalists that are writing on the topic, they don't seem to get, is that there is a middle ground, and that you need to be on that to have unbiased coverage.
Yeah, and I think whenever the Indigenous file comes into it, as is with this case, there's always going to be some form of bias, because you can see that when it comes to pipelines as well. For example, here, you look at in general pipeline safety and how we see pipelines as the fastest and most secure way to transfer oil. But whenever there's discussion of a new pipeline coming around, the media is always first to go get the perspective of the Indigenous people around that area, and they have their own perspective with that, just as is happening here with the fish farms as well, when the other side of the fish farm story isn't necessarily being reported on here by the media. So I think we hit the nail on the head with that one.
Indeed.
Alrighty then. Moving a little bit further eastwards now, we're going to head to Alberta and talk a little bit about the municipal elections that happened this week. This past Monday, of course, was municipal election day across Alberta, practically everywhere from Fort McMurray down to Calgary and beyond. Edmonton saw Mayor Don Iveson reelected with 72% of the vote. Well, Calgary's outcome was a little bit closer. So to provide a little bit of a background on the race in Calgary, it was expected that the race indeed would be close, and that perhaps Mayor Nenshi could have been in danger of being unseated by challenger Bill Smith. Now, you might be wondering who Bill Smith is and why he put up such a challenge to Nenshi aside from external factors. Well, he's the former president of the now merged Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta, and Bill Smith campaigned on a platform of tax reform and reining in City Hall in Calgary. We also know that Mayor Nenshi felt the heat of the campaign because during the campaign, Nenshi himself, who has been an otherwise charismatic leader, ultimately resorted to playing the racism card in the final days of the campaign. I think we both remember when that came up. That was a sign to you and I that something was indeed up with this race. It was going to be a lot closer than people thought it was going to be. But of course, there's also lots of external factors that existed that show that the race was in play, such as that Calgary has the highest unemployment rate in the country, and there's a series of municipal issues relating to LRT and taxes that hurt the last city council. So now we come in with a headline from the Calgary Herald that says, Mainstreet's future with post-media uncertain after botched Calgary election poll. And on Monday, we saw a day of lineups and slow vote counting, and it was ultimately revealed that Nenshi won Calgary's mayor's election by about 8 points. And this is a huge swing from the previous election when he won with over 70% of the vote. So combined with the factors mentioned previously, Nenshi actually faced a credible challenger, and with a campaign apparatus, unlike how the race in Edmonton unfolded. All these factors contributed to Nenshi's diminished win in the past Monday's election. And that's where Post-Media, Global News, Mainstreet, Research, the polling company, CBC, and a bunch of other media outlets come in. So I think we all know we have talked about polls before, most recently with the Forum Research poll showing that the Conservatives were ahead of the Liberals federally, and then those were later corroborated by later polls. But there was also polling done in the Calgary municipal race, which is kind of a rarity when it comes to municipal election races. So during the race, it was forecast that Bill Smith was leading Nenshi in a series of polls. The first poll put him ahead by 9 points. The second poll had a 1,500 sample size rather than the 1,000 sample size from the previous one, had Bill Smith leading by 17 points. That poll also showed that Bill Smith's support with the under 35 category of voters was at 61%. And this was considered a red flag by many, considering that that is not the typical demographic that would vote for a candidate like Bill Smith. To further verify these results, Mainstreet Research surveyed more residents in 5 randomly selected wards of the city. And in 2 of these, Nenshi had a double-digit lead over Smith, but the others mirrored the results of the previous 2 polls. And the final poll from Mainstreet Research showed that Smith was ahead of Nenshi by 13 points. So meanwhile, while this was happening, Forum Research, which we talked about recently in regards to federal polling, had a poll that was run between September 28th and October 12th, and this gave Nenshi a 17-point lead, obviously completely reversed. This poll was carried out online and had a sample size of 843. There was also another online poll conducted by the relatively unknown firm Asking Canadians that put Nenshi 15 points ahead of Smith using a sample size of 1,004. As we can see here, it was not only that Mainstreet Research was wrong in the outcome of their poll, but both Forum and Asking Canadians were also wrong in their magnitude of Nenshi's win as well. So a question I want everyone to have in their mind as we go through this story is, should media companies cut their ties with these other firms as well? These ones being Forum and Asking Canadians. So this past Thursday, Mainstreet said that they would be taking additional steps to ensure validity of future results, including an internal review of every Mainstreet survey done over the past 2 years, looking at its research methods, and seeking opinions from outside experts. Mainstreet will also conduct its Alberta polls with live agents rather than automated voice response. On Postmedia's part, they said Postmedia is awaiting the results of Mainstreet's internal review of their methodology and their communications before we make any decision about our partnership. In the meantime, any polling with Mainstreet is on hold until the review is done. So here's where we see that Postmedia, which of course owns the Calgary Herald, the Calgary Sun, Edmonton Journal, Edmonton Sun, and a good selection of papers across Canada, has put their relationship with Mainstreet Research on hold. It's also worth noting that the CBC reported on these Mainstreet polls and neglected to include any criticism of the data, and they also didn't highlight Postmedia's big red flag, or the so-called big red flag, that the under 35 category was also overwhelmingly voting for Bill Smith, according to the poll. So now is the time when the political scientists come in, and the one who commented on this is Dwayne Bratt from Mount Royal University. He was highly critical of Mainstreet's polling as well, and said that the Postmedia papers, the Calgary Herald and the Sun, should also look at internally on how they reported on the surveys, and he believes that the criticisms of the polls should have been included in their reporting, which is of course something we've been saying for a while here at the Right Side as well. This makes total sense, as any of the stories from the Herald, Sun, or even the CBC have nothing about the potential volatility in results, or that there may have been an underlying problem with the data that was gathered. And for this criticism, Dwayne Bratt was attacked on Twitter by Mainstreet Research, saying that critics would face, quote, retribution. Later, Chief Executive Quid O'Magey of Mainstreet apologized to Dwayne Bratt, and this ultimately leads us to a final question. If relationships between media organization and polling firms are to be severed over a roughly 20-point differential in the wrong direction, what should happen to those firms who got the result right but were wildly off, such as Forum? Now, also imagine what would have occurred if this had happened in any of the previous provincial or federal elections where the polls have been off. So, Alberta 2012, BC 2013, I believe, and of course Canada 2011. So it raises some interesting questions about why this is happening now, of all times, when we have had polling firms off in magnitude and actual winner before, but they haven't really faced much criticism in the past.
Yeah, and there's, I think, 2 options you can go with that. I think the first one is that either it's because the media is actually starting to pay attention to polls a lot more so than they used to in the past, and that the methodology is out there on the internet, which is a lot easier to research than it would have been before. And the other option, of course, is that there has been a lot of noted polls to be wrong in the past, so they're looking at them a lot more critically. The question is why are they singling out Mainstreet
Yeah,
as the only
yeah,
one to be severing ties with, and why aren't they just doing this with all the rest of the
exactly.
polls?
I mean,
And I
Main
think,
Street said that Bill Smith was going to win. Forum said that Nenshi was going to win, but got the magnitude off by 9 points. Nenshi won by 8 points. Forum said he was going to win by 17 points. So,
mhm.
um,
and all of those results are out of the margin of error
oh,
too.
wildly.
So there was clearly something that was going on there. Now the real question is, why aren't the media just announcing any form of polls? Because as we've said here on the right side before, you really have to take polls
Yeah,
with a grain of
yeah.
salt,
They can
especially when
influence
it comes to
results.
picking political winners.
Yeah,
Because the questions that can be asked, they may produce different answers, and people sometimes aren't generally willing to say who they're going to support politically. A lot of people keep that close to the chest, especially before an election day. Uh, Now, the wondering why they don't denounce these polls, and it's because it's something that's interesting. They want to put something out there so that there's a story
right.
that someone is predicting someone to win, so that if it does happen, then they can say, well, the polls were in favor of this, so this was expected. Or if the polls were off, they'll say, well, the polls didn't see this. This came out of nowhere. It was an unexpected victory for so and so, and there's a story there. So what they're doing is they're trying to make a story out of out of something that there wouldn't normally be a story if they actually took the polls with a grain of salt, as they should.
Right. And this leads to the obvious conclusion here that, polls can influence the way people vote. Polls are hard to understand unless you actually go into the actual methodology and the data that the polling firms provide. And not everyone has the time to do that. So if the media is not going to report it with all these caveats, maybe they just need to stop reporting on polls during an election period.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because polls will definitely influence how someone feels about a particular party. I mean, look back to the 2015 election. The NDP were ahead for quite a while, and all of a sudden, people started taking note of that, and they decided, "Gee, maybe I don't actually want an NDP government." And then, lo and behold, Trudeau and the Liberals came up the middle and ended up winning, when a lot of people in a week or 2 weeks before thought they were still going to be the third party. It's
Yeah.
amazing how many got wrong, and yet nothing happened to any of them. So just now, in a municipal election, there's actually going to be consequences for these polls, and it's very interesting that that is what started it all off.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at what the media has and hasn't been allowed to report on before, preventing them from reporting on polls during an election period wouldn't be, a huge violation of freedom of the press. Because if you look back, and you want to see something really draconian, look back to the laws regarding election night, in that it was at one point, I think in the 2011 race or maybe the 2008 race, it was illegal for you to look at results online if your polls were still open.
Hmm.
So if you want to look at draconian laws that existed and were on the books, they were there. So I don't think this would be pushing that far if the media wasn't allowed to discuss polls during a race. So, anyways, we'll have to see what comes from this for Alberta 2019 and Canada 2019, and maybe BC if you guys have one sooner. But I'm glad that this is being moved out into the forefront. So,
Indeed.
all right. So speaking of the NDP federally,
Yeah, let's go on to our next topic here, where um, new NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has had a bit of an interesting time with the media. So earlier this month, CBC journalist Terry Molesky, who spent much of his career following the Air India investigation, he asked new NDP leader Jagmeet Singh to denounce those in the Sikh community who celebrate Talwinder Singh Parmar as a martyr for Sikh independence. Now, Parmar, who was a naturalized Canadian citizen from British Columbia, he was identified by the RCMP INP and CSIS investigation as the leader of the 1985 Air India bombing, and that killed 329 people, most of them who were Indo-Canadians who were on their way from Canada back to India. Flight 182 exploded on June 23, 1985. After Sikh extremists were fighting for an independent state from India, they planted 2 bombs on the plane and then it blew up. It was then the deadliest terrorist attack on an airplane until the events of 9/11. Parmer ended up being killed by Indian police in 1992 on an unrelated charge. So in the interview, Molesky asks Singh if those who celebrate Parmer's actions are wrong. And like any good politician, Singh deflects that. And he mentions how growing up he had a lot of Hindu friends and family that worked hard to heal the rift between Hindus and Sikhs. Molesky then asked the question again, slightly differently, and Singh repeated his answer that Sikhs and Hindus can coexist together. And when Molesky mentioned the question a third time, he mentioned that it was the Indian government who was perpetrating genocide against the Sikhs. In Singh's answer, he didn't mention the bombing or Parmer whatsoever. He was actually referring to an incident that happened a year before in 1984. The New Delhi riots, where there were a lot of riots in between the Sikh minority and the Hindu majority, who were propped up, who were basically supported by the government and the police. And so Singh mentioned that the violence must be denounced and that he didn't know who was responsible of the Air India attack. He said, quote, "I don't know who is responsible, but I think that we need to find out who is truly responsible. We need to make sure that the investigation results in a conviction of someone who is actually responsible. And we need to, as a society collectively, unequivocally denounce any time that innocent lives are lost. That is something unacceptable." Singh later said Sunday that he wasn't sure what Molesky was asking about when the CBC interview veered towards Parmer. "At the time, I didn't know who he was referring to," the NDP leader said in a response to a Huffington Post question about why he had not denounced the posters. Quote, "But I made it absolutely clear, unequivocally, that I condemn any violence against anyone in the world. It was offensive to me that was even a question. It is so obvious that any Canadian would unequivocally denounce anyone who is held responsible. The question to me was very troubling. He put that question forward with such an obvious response expected. I responded very clearly." And then he said, "It's just unacceptable. It is fundamentally something that we all denounce." He was then asked if Molesky's question asking Singh to denounce Parmer was racist. He responded, "Should I just say yes directly? I think there was definitely some sort of clear problematic line of thought behind that question, so I'm definitely concerned with it," he told Reporter Sunday when asked if he felt the questions were racist. "I didn't know about the specifics of what Molesky was asking about. Air India happened when I was about 5 years old, but I'm very clear on, and have been clear on, I've attended memorials with respect to the victims and their families, survivors of this horrible and heinous act. I've talked about how everyone denounces it. At the same time, I didn't know what Molesky's goal was, what he was trying to achieve. I made it very clear I denounce anyone held responsible. We've had our inquiries, we've had courts. Anyone held responsible needs to be denounced. And in fact, there are still a lot of questions that are unanswered, and people have questions about this. People need to have justice."
Oh, there's that key word again.
I know, right? Justice. It's always raining. So, anyways, in an emailed response, Molesky said that the questioning that Singh finds offensive never happened. He said, quote, "No one asked him to condemn the Air India bombing itself, or what was going on with it. Instead, he was asked whether it was appropriate to celebrate Canada's worst mass murder with martyr posters. He declined to answer then, and declines to say now whether the posters should come down because, quote, I'm not here to tell what a community should or shouldn't do." So it's very clear from the recent interviews that Singh is very much a newcomer when it comes to dealing with the media, and he will have missteps when it comes to answering questions. However, this was a clear-cut opportunity to denounce terrorism and those who celebrate a terrorist as a martyr, and he failed to do so. It really raises questions as to why he wouldn't condemn the actions of Parmer. And is he worried about losing support from people in this country that vote and don't consider the now dead terrorist to be a terrorist?
And, this is shaping up for a very important showdown at some point during the 2019 campaign when Singh is inevitably asked if he will condemn terrorism when it arrives. That is something we saw that was an issue with Justin Trudeau on the campaign trail of the 2015 race. Later, after becoming prime minister, he has called events terrorism when they are terrorism, and relatively quickly. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes for Singh as well. I think it kind of goes a little bit far in regards to what the NDP and the Singh stand for, that in one of the very first interviews that Singh does, the questions get called racist. That says a lot, I think.
And I almost think we talked a bit about this at the time, and I had my own theory about this, and I think that when he was asked the question, he was really caught off guard. I was watching the interview, and you could see just his eyes, his pupils dilated quite a bit, which meant I think he was caught off guard by the question, and he didn't really know how to respond. So he kind of went back into his old routine, and at the time, I almost thought that he didn't actually know who Palmer was, or what the bombing was as well. Now Singh's a pretty young guy. I mean, he's 38, and as he said, the bombing did happen when he was 5 years old, so he'd only be learning about it secondhand. But I think what had happened was that he probably didn't know about it, and he wasn't sure who caused it, and he didn't have all the information. And rather than admitting that he didn't know about it, which would make him look really bad, I think he threw out the racism card, because it's better to make it look like a reporter is being racist towards him than it would be if he was ignorant about the Canada's worst mass killing in history. So I think that was what happened there, and that later on he actually found out about it, and then he actually did discuss it. But when he was responding to Molesky's question, he made no mention of Palmer or of the Area India bombing whatsoever. He was talking about the New Delhi riots and something else that happened as well. So
yeah, that's a very clear deflection. When you put it that way.
It was very much a politician's deflection, trying to deflect the question and make it go away. So then when Molesky kept going after him, then he calls him racist. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And we're gonna have to see where that goes in future campaigns, I think. So.
And future questions, when the media asks him a question that he doesn't like, is he going to call them racist too? I mean, this is one of the problems that comes about when it comes to reporters and politicians.
You can't be calling your opponents racist.
No, especially when they're not being racist either. This was a clear-cut case of someone who is just asking a question if they could denounce a terrorist for his actions and to stop people from celebrating them as a martyr. And he couldn't do that. He still hasn't done it. And
that's
who
very
knows
troubling.
if he'll do it in the future. It is very troubling.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's perhaps the avenue that should have been reported and followed up by the media on this then. So.
Indeed.
All right, so moving on to Firing Line, we're going to stick with Canada here. And this, of course, is referring to the big elephant in the room, and that is the finance issues with Bill Morneau. So our finance minister, Bill Morneau, is ultimately one of the wealthiest people in federal politics today in Canada. This wealth comes from a family-owned business known as Morneau Chappell. Morneau Chappell is a pension and human resources management firm that was founded by his father. So when the new Liberal government formed in 2015, a week after that election, Bill Morneau distanced himself from the company by resigning as both an officer and a director. Normally this would be all well and good, but his holding of shares in Morneau Chappell this past week would have been valued at 43.3 million Canadian dollars. The waters became murkier with this because after his resignation, any shares he sold would not have shown up in the public Morneau Chappell records. We'll come back to shares and dividends in a moment, but first let's have a look at what should have been done. Canada's Ethics Commissioner, Mary Dawson, has been tight-lipped on whether or not Morneau sold shares to the company. since he's been elected. The ethics commissioner is also typically consulted on what should be done in situations like Morneau's. The typical action is to either place the controlled assets into a blind trust or to sell the assets in an arm's length transaction. Now, a blind trust is basically an account where your assets, portfolio, and any other holdings that you have will be managed by someone else, and you have zero insight or say in what happens with them while they are in that blind trust. And basically, this is ultimately considered the best way to get around conflict of interest if you're in a position such as Bill Morneau's. This is something that the U.S. Treasury Secretary has to do when they become Treasury Secretary, which I think makes sense given the scope of that job. And Canada's finance minister should also have to do that given how large of a job he has. So it was also revealed that the assets weren't transferred to a blind trust, and this was indeed confirmed by the Federal Ethics Commissioner. What Morneau did confirm is that the Ethics Commissioner did recommend a, quote, screen, and that we have the assurance of the finance minister that the, quote, ethics rules and guidelines are being fully complied with. So we have the assurance of a politician here that he is fully complying with all ethics rules and guidelines. The ethics commissioner is not confirming to deny whether or not shares were sold in Morneau-Chappell since Morneau has been elected. If it turns out that shares were indeed sold, then that would be a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest because the changes to small business taxes and pensions could ultimately force small business owners to purchase private pension plans, and Morneau-Chappell could ultimately benefit from this. This week, the Conservatives dedicated their opposition day to grilling the government on this subject. The comparison was made by Conservative finance critic Pierre Poilievre that even when he was a parliamentary secretary, he placed his assets in a blind trust. Meanwhile, the NDP hammered home the point that if Bill C-27, which deals with pensions, became law, that Morneau-Chappell would outright benefit from the provisions it provides. By Thursday, Morneau announced that he has, quote, about 1 million shares in Morneau-Chappell, and has announced that he will sell the rest of the holdings of the company and place the rest of his assets in a blind trust. So this was after a number of days of being hounded on this repeatedly in question period and in the media at press conferences and the like. The story had to get rather murky before it got to this point, though. Based on the share price of Morneau-Chappell currently, Bill Morneau has receiving a check every month for roughly $65,000 in dividends for each month that he has been an MP. These dividends he has received has totaled $1.625 million Canadian. Another interesting note about this story is that his wife, Nancy McCain, is an heir to the McCain Foods Company. Though this investigation has revealed that Morneau owns a Toronto-based holding company, which owns most of an Alberta-based investment company in Canada, which basically means that Morneau owns one company that owns another company in Alberta. This is basically a way of saying that some of the assets that Morneau and his wife hold are actually being held in Alberta because of tax reasons. Also with this, his wife is the president of the Toronto company and the director of the Alberta-based company. The Alberta company apparently generates income for his wife, according to the disclosures that have been made, and Bill Morneau also jointly owns 4 numbered Ontario real estate holding companies with his siblings. Florida land records show that these companies each own a series of condominium properties in West Florida. Each of these are valued at more than $500,000. So while the focus has been on Morneau-Chappell and any potential conflicts of interest within that company, it's quite clear that the blind trust was needed. With all of these companies, it's a wonder how there was no push earlier on for a blind trust when conducting business for Canada and determining Canada's fiscal policy. Once again, this ultimately shows the division from Trudeau's Real Change campaign, focusing on transparency and an open and accountable government, when one of his top cabinet officials is a multimillionaire claiming to represent the middle class in Canada and has been benefiting from one of his multimillionaire companies ever since becoming an MP to the tune of $1.625 million.
Yeah, and this was they've been in power for 2 years, almost to the day. I think the 2 year anniversary was just a couple days ago, and it's amazing that this hadn't come up before then,
No,
because I think it's within 120 days, I believe, of becoming a minister that you're supposed to have your assets in a blind
right.
trust, so that there's no potential
Yeah,
conflict of interest scenarios. And this is now 2 years later,
yeah.
and only since media the media has been talking about this, and since the Conservatives and the other opposition parties have been almost united on this issue in opposition to Morneau's dealings, that it's actually come to light. Now, it's amazing how it took so long to get to light on this. And Bill Morneau, when he was first elected and when he was first tapped to being finance minister, he was seen as a bit of a star candidate for the Liberals, wasn't he? He
Oh
was a
yeah, I
successful
mean,
businessman.
that's
And
what you
he
want in a
was
candidate.
know the ins of out in and outs of the Toronto stock market, and he was generally regarded as someone who was very knowledgeable in what he would have to do as a finance minister. And it turns out, yeah, he is very knowledgeable, because he's trying to get around all of the rules that he has to do, and he's actually making a legitimate profit off of the rules that he's changing to benefit his own company. Now, that's something that's very, very different from what Trudeau promised as an open, fair government. They said they would do politics differently than the Conservatives, and but it seems like not even the Conservatives would do something like this
Yeah.
now.
I mean, the point that says it for me is that the ethics commissioner recommended a quote screen, and the assurance we have is the direct assurance from Bill Morneau himself that quote all ethics rules and guidelines are being fully complied with.
Hmm.
That says it all right there. And it seems as though after the assets were put into a blind trust, granted it's the weekend, we'll have to see if this story comes back for another round next week, but it seems as though that this has been largely diffused by that move. We'll just have to wait and see if it comes back going forward. So
And what's really interesting about this is that this probably wouldn't have come to light if there wasn't so much attention on the small business tax plan that Bill Morneau and the Liberals have been trying to push through Parliament and get done. Uh, and it turns out that they did a lot of investigating to see who would actually be profiting from the small business tax changes, and it's no surprise now that Bill Morneau is actually at the top of that list with all of his holdings in Morneau Chappelle. So
right,
he almost shot himself in his own foot there
right, and
just
ask
by.
yourself what kind of Canadian has a holding company based out of Ontario that owns another company in Alberta to send profit to your wife.
Yeah. And given that he's the finance minister, you'd think there would be a bit of a spotlight on what he's doing. And eh, I mean, and Trudeau has been very, very defensive about all this too. When the media was trying to ask questions of Morneau, and to get to the bottom of this, Trudeau ended up taking all the questions, and he said, "You, I think the quote was, you get to ask questions of the prime minister, um, and you should be happy that I'm answering them for you," or something along that lines. It was very bizarre, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It's almost like, hey, I'm here. Look at me. Look at me. Ask me questions.
Yeah, don't focus on him. Who's he? I'm here. You should be talking to me instead. You should be happy that I'm here to talk to you. It was very odd, and I don't think this story will go away. I think it will continue on until there's a successful resolution of all the problems that are along with it.
Yeah. You think he's done as finance minister? Or are we not to that point yet?
I don't think we're at that point yet, because look what happened with the other ministers that were in cabinet shuffle. It happened quite a while after their scandals happened.
Yeah.
And, I mean, Harjit Sajjan, as Minister of Defense, he had quite the scandal with his, architect of the mission in Afghanistan, he's still the defense minister. So, and that went on for quite a while. And Minister of Democratic Reform, they had a scandal. Minister of Heritage was caught basically on camera lying to Parliament about the dealings that her candidate for one of the commissioners for culture and languages commissioner actually had talked to the prime minister's PMO before, and she's still the heritage minister. So I mean, there's been a lot of scandals that have happened with Trudeau's government, and the ministers haven't gotten fired yet. So I think
we owe part of that to the media.
Yeah, I think Morneau will still be the finance minister after this is all said and done, but we'll have to see what happens. I mean, anything can happen in politics.
That's right. All right, that leads us nicely to our word of the week, and the word of the week this week is conflict of interest, which of course makes sense with the Morneau-Chappelle story, the conflict of interest regarding the polling companies and the not complete disclosures of potential anomalies with the data. So to sum this up, a conflict of interest is a situation in which a corporation or person with a vested interest in a company becomes unreliable because of the clash between personal interest and professional interests. And of course, in the polling story, that was the idea to generate a story based on polling numbers, even though we might know that these numbers aren't exactly accurate. An example of conflict of interest would be a board member voting on the induction of lower premiums for companies with fleet vehicles when he is the owner of a truck company outside of the corporation. In relation to law, representation by a lawyer or party with a vested interest in the outcome of the trial would be considered a conflict of interest, and the representation would not be allowed. So I think we see conflict of interest in a couple of our stories this week at the right side.
Indeed, yeah, it's definitely a huge conflict of interest, and something that should be looked at really closely in the media, especially in regards to the polling firms as well as Bill Morneau.
Indeed. Well, that about wraps up this episode of The Right Side. If you guys want full show notes, you can find that at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. And if you wish to subscribe to us, you can do that on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes and /YouTube. And with that being said, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
And we will always be here to give you the right side of the news. We'll stay tuned, and we'll be back next week.